If I may quote Peter Levine, what he also shares about trauma is that trauma healed can be a beautiful gift. And it can really tap people back into their essential, what I call the essential blueprint, right, that we're kind of born with. With trauma also comes the innate kind of capacity of cultivating many different qualities that make us human, such as courage, empathy, compassion, aliveness.
Welcome to the Mindspace podcast. I'm Joe Flanders. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Atira Tan. Atira is a trauma therapist, educator, and activist. She's worked with survivors of child sex slavery, natural disasters, domestic violence, and actually has a very compelling TED Talk about these experiences. She's also the founder and director of the Art to Healing Project, a nonprofit that provides therapeutic support to women and children impacted by child sex slavery. Atira also provides training to practitioners in trauma-informed plant medicine facilitation, which in my view is increasingly important harm reduction work as more and more people explore psychedelics in the underground. Our conversation explored Atira's experience working with trauma survivors, the tricky definition of trauma, different conceptions of trauma across cultures, how trauma is healed, and the importance of trauma sensitivity in psychedelic healing. Without any further delay, here is my conversation with Atira Tan. Atira Tan, welcome to the Mindspace podcast.
Thank you. It's a privilege and honor to be here, so thank you so much, Joe.
I feel that it's a privilege for me to have you, especially because it's coming up on, bedtime for you pretty soon. You're in Asia right now, right? Can you tell us where you're located?
Yes. At the moment, I'm here in Thailand, in the south of Thailand, on an island called Koh Lanta, which is an island in the Andaman Sea. It's absolutely beautiful here.
Amazing. And is that home for you, or you holding out for everyone to get over COVID, or what's the plan?
Well, I'm actually here in Koh Lanta on a small vacation because where I live in Chiang Mai, which is in the north of Thailand, there's a smoky season. So the farmers up there kind of use the slashing and burning in agriculture. So every month, people that live in Chiang Mai need to kind of get out because it becomes the most polluted city in the world. So I'm here in Koh Lanta on a kind of working holiday, and it's lovely to get to the beach during this time.
Okay, Atira, can you tell us, you said you're on a working holiday. What exactly do you do for work? And maybe just a quick bio and history of how you got into this line of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a somatic trauma specialist and an educator. And I also run a charity where I founded working with child sex slaves here in the region of Asia. So being a kind of trauma therapist for the past almost 2 decades, it's something that I am very, very passionate about. Most of my life and history, I've worked in many different sectors, but I first started my work as an art therapist, as a creative art therapist, and started to work with survivors of sex trafficking in Asia at as one of the beginning kind of points of my career. In addition to working with women and girls who have been sold in child sex slavery, a lot of my professional life has also centered around working with chronic and severe trauma, for example, working in war zones, refugee camps, in slums and brothels, earthquake recovery, in international development. So I guess my one of my deepest passions and curiosities in the world is around this question: how do we heal, both individually and also as humanity, as a society? And so the work that we'll be talking about today, the work in plant medicine and psychedelics, are very informed by my working experiences working with populations that have been through a lot of trauma, and also having the privilege to kind of hold safe spaces for them in order for them to heal and to recover. Yeah. So a lot of my work is kind of informed by the experience that I've had working with many different cultures, working with many different kind of populations, many different bodies in different societies. And I'm really looking forward to sharing what I've learned in this field.
That's great. So I have a bunch of questions for you, but there was something about the little exchange we had just before I hit record that I'd love to unpack a little bit. And you said something about one of your intentions for our conversation is to make sure that this interview is like kind of a safe space for listeners. And I'm just curious what you mean by that and how you actually practice over the course of the interview, like sustaining that. What does that mean exactly?
That's a wonderful question and a great segue, I think, into our conversation. So for me, I think that, the conversation as a somatic kind of trauma specialist, the conversation around trauma has to do with the nervous system and our kind of relationship with the nervous system, because the trauma is very connected to our biophysiology. When we kind of look at trauma and creating safe spaces, as a somatic trauma therapist, a specialist, the first thing that I look at is the nervous system in the space. So, we're having this conversation, you and I, and our, space in the interrelational field kind of affects each other and creates that kind of container of safety. And in this podcast, in this interview, when I extend my awareness to the, audience that is kind of listening, my hope for the audience is that this interview can be a very kind of grounding, stable, and regulating conversation for them, so that as we draw the audience into our words and the content that we're speaking, that this work will really support listeners to find that sense of self-regulation or co-regulation in the space that we're creating together, Joe. Yeah. So I think that really kind of, there are many factors to creating safety, but as, the two people that are anchoring this space, it means that, I am regulated and you're regulated, and we can both co-regulate each other through our social engagement, and hopefully that will ripple out into the audience which are listening to as well.
Interesting. And I guess, one thing I'd like to do is just get granular about what kind of practices we can do to be trauma informed, and maybe we'll come back to that. One of the things that is very intriguing to me about this topic is the precision of the language or maybe lack thereof. I've been working as a therapist for many years, and I feel like the word trauma has gone through a few different kind of like iterations or something, and it's come to mean something quite different now than it did, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. I wonder if we can just take a minute and talk about the definition of trauma, and maybe how widely how widely applicable it is in our civilization, let's say. So what exactly do you mean by trauma?
That's a really, really great question. And for this answer to the question, I would love to really draw upon some resources specifically from somatic experiencing, which, is the approach that I use in this body of work. And the teacher of somatic experiencing, Dr. Peter Levine, he shares a wonderful, I think, definition of trauma that is really kind of the foundation in my understanding of it. So Peter Levine, he writes in his book, Waking the Tiger, that trauma, simply put, arises where there is a lack of choice, something from which we are unable to escape from, something which is overwhelming to the nervous system, and it leads to the disconnection from ourselves and others, and it impacts our ability to be present. So what I love is kind of breaking down kind of this statement, because I feel that this statement is a great definition of trauma. And essentially, trauma disrupts our ability to be in the here and now. And it is around the loss of connection to ourselves, the loss of connection to our bodies, what is happening in the inner atmosphere of our bodies in terms of emotions and sensations, thoughts and energy. But it's also the loss of connection to the world around us. So for example, our environment, our families, and other people. And what can happen as well with trauma is that it's usually something that happens too fast, too soon, or is too quick. And the pace of it, the rhythm of it overwhelms us so that we are not able to be present. And for many people, trauma can really impact our physiology and our well-being, because it can also rob us of this, what we call a felt sense of safety. So feeling safe and settled on the inside. And because of this kind of, what we call neuroception, or this kind of sense of danger that might be happening due to trauma, it can really kind of, disconnect us from the present moment. And it can also overwhelm our capacity to perhaps cope and respond to certain situations, or also leaving us feeling helpless, hopeless, or feeling kind of out of control as well. What I would also like to share is that there are also many kind of different categories of trauma and different ways that we respond to trauma. So when we kind of, I think, step into the field of holding safer spaces for people, it's really kind of important to get a sense and understanding of the different categories of trauma that people may have been through, and also the responses of trauma in the body, which are instinctual, to all organisms.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. I also really like the Peter Levine framing of it. One of the things I've seen in talking about, how to define trauma is the relative weight that the definition puts on the nature of the event itself versus the nature of the response in the body. So many of the definitions will talk about, threat to life and limb, or distressing event, or a terrible event, and car accident, rape, natural disaster, just reading something off of the APA website. Peter Levine doesn't talk at all about the external circumstances. It really is located, the frame of reference is the person's nervous system. I have a follow-up to that, but maybe I'll just pause there. How do you think about the nature, like the conditions that tend to give rise to these responses?
Yeah, I think that trauma really kind of lies on a spectrum. And I think that, having worked in many different cultures, our Western world is also very different from other, perhaps, say, collectivist cultures out there. So I think that, if I would, just talk about perhaps the Western world that we live in, I think that what's really important to note is that there are also very different types of traumatic experiences out there, and some of them you have kind of named. So, for example, a certain event, say a high velocity accident, for instance. But, trauma with that definition with Peter Levine, really gives, I think, the individual the locus of control of their experience rather than an external circumstance that has happened to them. So there are many different types of categories of trauma. So for example, from, perinatal trauma, for instance, to more kind of cumulative experiences like in attachment or perhaps in development, for instance, where perhaps we lived in an environment that was unsafe. So it wasn't so much an event that happened, rather the environment and living in a, either dangerous or inconsistent household can also be very, very overwhelming for the system. In addition to that, I think what's really important too when we look at trauma and how people respond are different, our personalities and also our resilience levels. So there are so many kind of factors, I think, around how people respond to trauma. So it's really, I think, important in this work to be client-centered, and for, therapists to really kind of understand the inner world of a client, because the same trauma can happen to two different people at the same time, but they can experience it very, very differently depending on their resilience level, their environment that they grew up in, and their personality and more factors.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just in the language just there, you said the same trauma can happen to two different people. It's actually the same event could happen to two different people, but one might experience that as trauma and the other may not, right?
That's right. Yes.
So yeah, this event and the response are often, it's often tricky to kind of disentangle them. I want to follow on this notion of that there's a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And, this might be like really not aligned at all, but I sometimes think like in some, at like one end of the spectrum, sometimes people use the word trauma where they used to use the word stress. Okay. And I'd love to get your take on that. As you were going through the different elements of Peter Levine's definition, you talked about like lack of choice, can't escape, overwhelming, loss of a sense of self. There may be others, but I just imagined like someone goes to a cocktail party and they have some conflict with someone, and that person kind of confronts them confronts them at this party, and it is overwhelming to this person. They sort of don't really have a choice because they feel trapped. Maybe this person is a superior at work or something. They can feel overwhelmed. And that stress response where, it's like a social anxiety or something, they really want to just bolt for the exit, but they're kind of trapped there. We used to call that like an acute anxiety response or a stress response or social anxiety or something. And yet somehow I can imagine someone saying that was traumatizing. I wonder like how you tease that apart.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, again, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but my understanding of it is that the response to an event like this is individualized. Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm. So in this, example that you've named, and it sounds like in this example that you've named, this person impulse was to go into a flight response to protect, itself. However, what happened is that impulse of flight was overridden, and this person may have gone into a freeze response, which is, feels like they can move, or because, perhaps the person that is confronting them is a superior, for instance. And I do kind of feel that this kind of points to a very important part in our Western world of how we respond to, overwhelm, that our tendency as a culture is to override. And when that happens, when we start to dismiss, I think, the body's response to keep us safe, which is either the fight or the flight response, the body goes into freeze because, again, the body feels like it doesn't have a choice to follow that protective impulse. So when I work with clients and when I look at the nervous system of a client when we are, say, processing, an event, part of the resolution of trauma in the body is to complete those protective responses. So in Peter Levine's model, the symptoms, for example, perhaps the shaking, or perhaps, this person might have, after this event, incessant thoughts, perhaps, bad dreams about what had happened. Perhaps they feel afraid to go back to work or to confront this, this person. Those are kind of symptoms that are these protective responses not being complete in the body. Yeah. So when I'm working with, perhaps a client around an event, it will be to help them to complete those protective responses in the body so that those symptoms can diminish.
So, it's interesting that this notion that completion might be if not one of the distinguishing factors between a stress response and a trauma response. That's interesting. I guess where I'm coming from here, it's funny, we're 20 minutes in and we're still talking about the definition of trauma. I appreciate your patience here. I think it'll be helpful as we get into the weeds on some of the other questions. One of the things I'm kind of curious about here in this discussion of the definition is, if being confronted at a cocktail party can be a traumatic experience, aren't we all traumatized? We're all walking around with PTSD because, point me out someone who's never, had an experience that, doesn't meet all of the Peter Levine criteria there. Seems pretty rare. Just like, I don't know, being born or, learning at some point as a child that you're kind of on your own, and hopefully your mom is able to take care of, or your dad or whoever is able to take care of some of your needs, but certainly a good chunk of the time you got to figure things out for yourself, and that's pretty damn scary. So is everyone traumatized? And then what does that say about the people who really did go through one of these events that we, I don't know, traditionally or in a more conservative definition might, appeal to like what's listed here on the AP website, an accident, rape, natural disaster, etc. So just, how do you think about that?
Wow, that's such a great question, Joe. Thank you so much. And I do agree with you that this conversation around trauma can be very deep before we get into, the kind of richness around the psychedelic and plant medicine space. So I think it's really helpful to have, dialogues and conversations around this. And, as a Buddha, to answer your question, my perspective is that, as a Buddha kind of shared, life is suffering. Mm-hmm. And it is perhaps one of the foundations of, perhaps Buddhist philosophy. So we are born into a life of suffering. And I think for most people, there are big T's and there are little T's, because I think in humanity, our shared suffering is something that connects us all. And in my work, and also if I may quote Peter Levine, what he also shares about trauma is that trauma healed can be a beautiful gift. And it can really tap people back into their essential, what I call their essential blueprint, right? That we're kind of born with. So this conversation about trauma can be a little bit heavy, but working with many, many different populations, I also have seen and witnessed that with trauma also comes the innate kind of capacity of cultivating many different qualities that make us human, such as courage, empathy, compassion, aliveness, just to name a few. Yeah. So when we talk about, I think the trauma that's kind of happening in the world and the spectrum of it, what I would love to bring into this conversation is that it's possible to heal, and there are gifts that actually come out from this journey of healing trauma, and that looks different for everyone. Yeah.
It's really the client-centered way of thinking, yes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So you work, if I understand correctly, in educating practitioners around what's known as trauma-sensitive therapy. Can you just tell us what that is and a little bit more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So one of my passions is to create a safer world for everybody. And one of the areas that I work in is in plant medicine and psychedelic-assisted therapies. So perhaps it would be helpful to kind of share in that context of what trauma-sensitive therapy or trauma-informed facilitation is. It's just simply put, my understanding of being trauma-informed means that we, as facilitators or people that are entering into this work, they understand and they're both kind of educated on how trauma affects the nervous system. And so therefore, the people that we invite into this space in plant medicine and psychedelic-assisted therapies engage in this work, which is very sensitive to that understanding. In this piece of work of being trauma sensitive, one of the foundational kind of landmarks is to be aware about re-traumatization and how perhaps entering this field of plant medicine and psychedelics can really, it's kind of like a space where people come to heal. So therefore, the trauma imprints are usually going to come out in this space. So as a trauma-informed facilitator or a therapist, what we are really looking for is to mitigate this risk of re-traumatization. And to provide kind of in a way the antidote to understand trauma and to understand that in order there is a rupture when a traumatic event happens, but there is also the possibility of repair. And when we are in this space, we are creating the environment and providing a response in a way where there could be a repair and also the facilitation of the antidote of what was missing when the traumatic event happened, rather than perhaps adding to the re-traumatization experience happening. So what I feel is kind of important is that in order to kind of be sensitive to trauma imprints that come out in this space, people have to be educated in trauma-informed care, because finding resolution and recovery from traumatic experiences, especially cumulative traumatic experiences, which is rampant in our Western society, is really not easy. It takes a lot of time. It takes effort. It takes specialized care, support, and presence. There are a lot of elements of trauma recovery and resolution where it's not a one-size-fits-all, as you mentioned. It's very client-centered and it depends on many, many different factors. So when we are trauma-sensitive, we have also a deep kind of understanding of the process of trauma recovery and resolution and how we can add to the antidote and the repair instead of perhaps being insensitive or dismissive or in some cases absent when these trauma imprints are coming out in the field.
It's the second time that you mentioned the Western world, and I'm glad I kind of picked up on it again the second time because I really wanted to follow up on that. And this is actually a nice opportunity. Earlier, you said we have a tendency in the Western world to override some of our responses. And then you also said just now that we tend to be exposed to a lot of potentially traumatizing events or conditions. Again, kind of like pulling on the external conditions and the internal response pieces, which is cool. And it's extremely cool that you've done this, the work that you're doing in different cultures. I wonder what else you could say about how it is in the West. What's different in the West exactly? Why are we exposed to more traumas? And what does it mean that we tend to repress or suppress or override, was your word, override our reactions?
That's a great question. What I've seen, so I'm just kind of going to share with the listeners out there, I'm Asian. I was born in Singapore, and I grew up in Asia, and then I moved to Australia when I was 16 years old. So I feel very fortunate to understand the more kind of collectivist kind of paradigm, I think, perhaps of Asia, but I've also seen that in different kind of cultures around the world as well. And also fortunate to have been raised in Australia too. So in a way, it almost feels like I have a Western body, but an Asian body, but a Western mind, so to speak. And what I've kind of noticed is that in different cultures, especially the more kind of collectivist culture, there is, versus the more individualist kind of culture, which is in the West. In the collectivist culture, it's kind of a little bit more of a village mentality. So, when we were born, we are very kind of family oriented and very kind of group oriented. And the focus is not so much on me, the individual, but us. And, working in many kind of indigenous communities as well. If a person is going through pain and suffering, usually the person is not alone. Yeah. And, for example, in some, indigenous, traditions that I've been in, if a person is going through, some kind of mental health issue, or for example, an emotional issue, the village knows about it, and the village will come and support the person through whatever kind of they're going through. And that might mean, bringing in a maestro or a shaman, or, speaking to family members. But the focus is not so isolating, I suppose, in certain different cultures. In the Western world, what I've noticed is there is a deep sense of inadequacy in the Western world, and also an emphasis that we have to do it alone by ourselves, and that if we do it alone, it will mean that we are better at doing it alone, and not needing the help of anyone else. And if we look back on the definition of trauma, definition of trauma is when we start to disconnect from ourselves, but also from our environment. Yeah. So I think that there is kind of a difference on how we respond to trauma in different kind of cultural contexts. And I can name many, which will probably take us a few hours. But for now, I will just name this one, the collectivist kind of paradigm versus the individualistic paradigm, because trauma recovery is something that doesn't happen alone. Most of these trauma imprints, we heal and regulate through also co-regulation. And we're meant to heal with people, especially with ruptures that happen in the interpersonal space, which is so much in trauma, is around relationships. Yeah. And when we are looking at creating repair around perhaps experiences that have been overwhelming in the interpersonal field, it's very important to have people there, and to and this aspect of trauma, which is around co-regulation.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is hopefully going to bring us back to what you were saying earlier about, your work is helping to train practitioners so that they understand and it could provide the support to clients and be help with the sort of the antidote and repair to trauma. I think I picked this up from Gabor Mate, and this might actually help us with the stress versus trauma distinction. Like pain and suffering and stress are inevitable in life. Maybe that's your comment about the Buddha. But it's when, there's something here about like, can we complete our response, but also can we recover from these experiences with support from others, right? It's so hugely important. And then, when someone's doing trauma-informed therapy, they're connecting to a therapist or some kind of group or whatever. And then maybe what you're suggesting is in more collectivist societies, that's kind of baked in to how people live, is that we're living in more sort of predominantly interconnected kind of group or society. So maybe we can come back to how you train people to do this work. It's complex. It's very challenging. It could be very heavy for the practitioners who have to hold a lot of suffering sometimes. How do you equip people or arm people with all the education and the fortitude and the skills?
So I run a couple of programs per year, and one of them is a trauma-informed plant medicine facilitation program. And I love this program because it touches on the different phases, I think, of this work with, plant medicine and psychedelic-assisted therapies, from preparation and also intention setting, really understanding kind of the category of trauma that when a person comes to an experience, to, what happens in that space, maybe the ceremonial space or the therapy session, and then what can happen afterwards. So to answer your question, diving into this world of trauma recovery and resolution, I think is a path which takes lifetimes. It's not, it's not just, I think, something that we kind of go for a course and then, suddenly we are, experts on trauma, so to speak. There's so many kind of layers to that. And I think that as, if the audience listening out there are practitioners in this work, I think that the most incredible kind of investigative field is our own bodies and how we kind of respond to trauma. And the conversation around this is so nuanced and expansive, and really it ties in with threads of life itself. Yeah, and how life blossoms and unfolds and unfurls and heals itself and births again, and it has the strings of life attached to this conversation around trauma. So to share as a disclaimer, I think in my perception, it is a journey that is never ending. And it's one that's extremely joyful, because as we step into this field, we also, I think as practitioners, start to understand how we work. And through that journey, I think it's a very humbling experience to understand ourselves and to develop such kind of empathy and compassion, I think, for ourselves and safety. So I see kind of this work as being very twofold. We learn what my intention is in this work in education is really providing people a transmission, or perhaps an embodiment, or an example of what it kind of means to be trauma informed in a way where it's embodied. So it's kind of on all the levels of the triune brain, the body, the heart, and the mind. So in these courses, I provide, the foundations to understand the nervous system and how we can understand each category of trauma, what self-regulation, what co-regulation is, certain things to avoid, repairs that we need to understand with the different categories of trauma, our language, our tone of voice, everything from, say, titration and the dosage of the medicine and how that can affect different kind of trauma imprints. But really, I think that the goal of a trauma-informed plant medicine facilitator or psychedelic-assisted therapist is to support participants to, number one, build their resiliency, establish a greater sense of self-regulation, and to support the trauma resolution which is unfolding in the session. And what I've seen is that when we can assist participants to feel really safe, and different participants will need different elements to feel safe depending on what they've been through, when we can assist them to orient, to feel supported, to track and to be connected to their felt sense in a slow way, which is their choice and agency. When they're feeling met and heard and empathized and attuned, then we're really creating that container to prevent re-traumatization from happening. So it's really more about, what we can do as facilitators to, I think, create that container and for the person to feel really met in that. Yeah. So this is what the course is providing the education on this. But again, having said that, it's a long road, long journey of learning, and it's a joyful one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. I think I know that a lot of the work you're doing is in the field of psychedelics, and I'm happy to kind of dive into that now. I wonder if you could give just like some highlights or some light kind of reflections on how the trauma-informed approach or this trauma sensitivity might show up in the different phases of the psychedelic healing. I think you said that the trainings you're doing are sort of structured around that. So there may be more, but how might we think about trauma sensitivity in like prep, during the actual medicine sessions, and then in integration?
Yeah. Well, I think that how I kind of understand working in the psychedelic and plant medicine space is that the medicine actually starts to kind of work with us when we've kind of said yes. So it doesn't just start in, when we enter the session. It actually starts way before with the intention when an individual says, yes, I'm going in for this experience and signs up. I believe that there's a kind of portal or connection with the medicine or with the intention of the participant. And what I kind of understand is that, people come into this space with plant medicine and psychedelics for many different reasons. But, for me as a somatic trauma specialist, I work specifically with people that come in who are wanting to heal trauma imprints. Something is not happening in their lives. They feel disconnected. They feel stuck. They feel blocked. Perhaps they're, been suffering from mental health issues for a while, and they want to be free from some of these imprints. So from the get-go, my sense is that in order to create that, safest space for people, there needs to be a dialogue around the intention of people wanting to, come in, what the categories of trauma are, what the symptoms they're experiencing in their lives, and also their intention for having the session. And if that can kind of be met with the same kind of attunement and care and empathy, which is kind of needed for this work, then as a result, a person will probably feel more regulated, more safe as they enter the session, and also kind of more prepared. As you know, this field of plant medicine and psychedelics, as we enter this altered state of consciousness space, it is a mystery, and this can create high arousal and high activation in the nervous system. So as we create a container of safety and prepare, help to regulate and discuss resources, but also understand the individuals that, entering the session with us as practitioners, we can really understand their needs in the session in a bigger way. And when that relationship has been made, people can feel more comfortable with us as practitioners, in order to, number one, have choice and agency around, the session. As a practitioner, we can also understand their needs, if these trauma imprints did arise. And we are more equipped to, as I mentioned, provide the antidote and the repair, rather than to amplify the rupture, so to speak. So I hope that I've answered your question.
I'd be curious to hear you say more about integration, how trauma sensitivity is important for integration.
Yeah, I feel that trauma sensitivity is very important in integration, as well as I think that integration from trauma imprints as well that arise in the plant medicine and psychedelic space. Because as a head of integration and eye healing retreats, I mostly see an example of perhaps a client that I see are people that enter psychedelic experiences where forgotten trauma imprints might come up to the surface. And trauma imprints also are not necessarily explicit. So people don't really understand, or perhaps the memories that arise to their consciousness are more in the implicit field. So more around sensations, more around emotions, perhaps, or perhaps visions that might be really, really scary. So a big bulk of my work in integration is to help people process some of these traumatic memories that come up, that can be very overwhelming, very confusing sometimes. They struggle to kind of make meaning of what kind of happened in the, psychedelic kind of session. And I think that, being trauma sensitive is really important, because part of this work is to assist participants to resolve some of these imprints that arise implicitly or explicitly in psychedelic sessions. Yeah. And I really love this work. This is a great love of mine. What I see, if I may share some examples of what I see of why it's really important in integration, is what I've noticed is a trend of participants going back to psychedelic kind of experiences or plant medicine experiences with facilitators that are not perhaps trained in trauma. And what I'm seeing is our participants that go back again and again to the same either psychedelic experience, who experience again that re-traumatizing experience that happened from the past over and over again. And commonly, they feel some kind of relief for perhaps 4 or 5 weeks, but then the symptoms come back again. So there are certain times where I feel that the work with plant medicine and psychedelics are not enough, and we really need to work with a trauma specialist in order to resolve some of these imprints. And I would love to see that kind of more and more in this field, in this area today. And what I have kind of witnessed in the clients that I've seen is this cycle, this perpetuating cycle of participants going back to the ceremonies, feeling relief, but then, experiencing those symptoms of, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, anxiety, chronic fatigue for years. And they keep going back to, the psychedelic space, feeling that it's only in this space where they can find some kind of freedom out of it. But what's really happening is that the person is amplifying that trauma vortex of that imprint. And within the integration sessions, we will, titrate, I think, these imprints, resolve and work through them. And what I've seen is that many of my clients are free from these trauma imprints without having to necessarily go back into that psychedelic space again. So I do feel that there are certain people that need that kind of trauma-informed care, especially if there are kind of traumatic memories or imprints coming out in the psychedelic and plant medicine space, that they need that kind of trauma support for resolution to happen.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'd be curious to get your take on this. One of the things, like you were talking about earlier about what's required to create a safe container in a ceremony, for example, and that as a psychedelic therapist, we all need to get really, really good at that because it's really, really important. But my experience as I do more psychedelic therapy with people who've experienced trauma is that the safe container is a necessary but not sufficient condition for people, for an imprint, as you say, to come up, or a traumatic memory to come up. Sometimes other things happen, and I've sort of developed this sense of we're not all going for the Disney version of the traumatic memory comes up. There's all kinds of fireworks in the session, and then there's some kind of processing and then a resolution to the trauma, and everyone lives happily ever after. It's usually a bit messier, and sometimes traumas don't come up at all in a medicine session. I wonder how that reflection lands with you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that trauma is a very messy space, and it's usually a lot of the time a painful process. It's a painful, long process too, because I think part of trauma resolution is, trauma happens when things are too fast, too soon, and too quick. So therefore, in sessions, the process to resolve trauma is actually something that's very slow, so that there can be digestion, there can be a metabolization, of what was overwhelming in the past. So I completely agree with you. I do feel that, entering that space, it is never straightforward, and it is never linear. It's not something that happens from A to B. It's a mystery, kind of like birth, and entering that birthing kind of space. You never really know what's going to happen. However, I can say with, a lot of conviction that in human beings, there is a will and desire to heal. And I think part of that process is finding that impulse of finding and holding what is wanting to emerge in the session or in that journey. And for many people, healing trauma is a process. It doesn't just happen in one session. It takes perseverance, it takes courage, it takes time. And depending on certain trauma imprints and the age that happened, or say, the event that happened, healing has its own time signature as well. Yeah. So I think with our neocortex minds, we want to heal and we want to look at it in a certain way. And a lot of the time it has its own intelligence. And part of the process is to settle and to rest in that intelligence, and also the rhythm, the time signature of the unfolding process. Yeah. And you're right, there are certain times in plant medicine and psychedelics, nothing happens. It's like waiting for the bus, so to speak, right? And that itself is also, has meaning to it. It's also rich in meaning too. How we respond to waiting for the bus, how we manage our expectations of nothing really happening. I think that everything in that session in the space is a reflection, or it can be a reflection of the workings of our inner atmosphere.
I've been thinking about your work, training practitioners in trauma-informed care as a kind of like harm reduction. Harm reduction strategy or harm reduction initiative or something like that. And this is obviously especially relevant now. There's been a little bit more kind of media coverage about the darker side of psychedelic experiences, maybe especially happening in the underground or even in clinical trials. I'm just curious, when you see this media coverage come up and threaten what could be a very important breakthrough for, mental health treatments and things like this. And when you see that coverage come up, what's your reaction? And how do you think we're going to get through this early period of, the development of psychedelic treatments and actually get to a point where they can be administered or the treatments can happen in a way that's safe and healing for people?
Yeah. So, as a kind of somatic trauma specialist, I think that I can be a little bit biased because I see many of my clients have been re-traumatized, traumatized or re-traumatized in that plant medicine and psychedelic space. So it's not okay for unsafe spaces in the psychedelic world. I can say that 100%, and that's how I feel about it. Is this sector, this area, this field can be highly irresponsible and also very unregulated. And I think that we are kind of in a space of really learning, and it's kind of a experimentation ground in a way. And I do feel that this area needs a lot more responsibility. So the leaders in this field, I think what can be missing, a few things that I find kind of missing in what's happening in our modern day culture is, number one, misinformation around trauma. Yeah, facilitators or a therapist not really understanding what trauma is. For example, what is the difference between trauma release and trauma resolution? For example, another myth that I really love to bust, especially in the plant medicine world is, if a person is in pain during a session, we are just going to leave the person alone, not go to the person because the medicine is doing the work. So what happens is that, the person goes more and more into kind of distress. And I think that part of it is due to a lack of education and information around, trauma and what people kind of need when these trauma imprints arise. So I think that information, education, and also kind of taking responsibility and accountability as leaders in this field, I would support and encourage, and I think that is very much needed. Another thing that I would like to see more in this field is research, especially with, I think working with different mental health, disorders, or people that come with anxiety, people that come with depression. Really, I think we need more kind of research and studies into the different elements that can create safer spaces for people. I really hope that can happen. And what I would really wish is for there to be more holistic, kind of integrated trauma-informed treatment plans that actually walk alongside this work in plant medicine and psychedelic-assisted therapies. Yeah. So these are, I think, this is a couple of my responses to what's happening at the moment. I think that the dangers, not say dangers, but I think what the risks of what could happen in that psychedelic and plant medicine space is very real. And I would encourage folks out there to take more responsibility in entering that space.
Are there other harm reduction considerations that come to mind for you above and beyond trauma sensitivity? Like, some things that really seem important that we're not necessarily taking care of? You can pass on that. It's not that important.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. I don't know. Therapists having experiential training so they know how to work with medicine, as just off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Or making sure that people have the resources and the space to do integration, because someone naive to psychedelics might not appreciate that it's actually, I don't know, like a week-long experience, month-long experience, year-long, lifetime-long experience. Like, I'm going to go do 5-MeO and hang out with my buddies after or something, Anyway, these are just things that come to mind, and, happy to just riff on that if you have any ideas. Not necessary, though.
I have many, many, many ideas. I'm not sure if I'm kind of answering your question in regards to kind of harm reduction, but I do kind of feel that there are many kind of different things that could support this space. So as I mentioned, I think that as therapists, experiential education is important, but I think that, having support for our own personal healing alongside, plant medicines and psychedelics is definitely a must. And also the relationship that we have to a certain kind of plant medicine or a certain kind of psychedelic tool that we're using. I think there is a commitment and a dedication to be on that lifelong path, I think, and also have the responsibility to also kind of focus on our own personal healing, because there's the two sides of the same coin. We can't really understand what it means to find and hold a safe space for other people if we haven't felt sense of safety in ourselves as therapists.
This is Go ahead.
Another thing that I really also kind of wanted to name is the importance, I think, of supervision, which I'm really advocating for many of my students, is that when we enter the space of being therapists, it's really important that we have really healthy boundaries around this work, but also that we also have the kind of support that we need in order to fully kind of be present and to show up for folks that we help and support. So I think as part of the harm reduction, certain things that have been really helpful are, regular kind of supervision sessions with a mentor, or even a peer supervision kind of session, and also our own personal therapy as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because this has been a really fascinating journey for me. Just the extent to which my own personal stuff comes up so much more, is so much more relevant when I'm doing psychedelic assisted work or even integration work or whatever. And it's not obvious from the outside. So there are many people who can do all kinds of therapy and help all kinds of people without a deep dive into their trauma history or whatever, what mental health challenges they may have. What is it about this field, psychedelic therapy, that requires so much work on the therapist part?
Yeah. So my answer to that is that it is my perception that when we enter the field of plant medicine and psychedelics, we enter different states of consciousnesses, which really are here. I mean, we are multi-dimensional kind of beings, so to speak. And as we kind of open the portal to these kind of, different altered state of, I think, consciousness experiences, that dance, I think, and the energy that we kind of bring in as a facilitator or as a therapist is weighty. And a lot more, I think, weighty as compared to perhaps a CBT therapist, because we are working with many different parts that make us human all at once. I believe that plant medicine and psychedelics work very much with implicit memory. So it works very deeply with the nervous system and sensations, the language of the nervous system being sensations. It also works with our emotional field. Yeah, it brings us into experiences with the divine, for instance. It can really open us up into connecting with all the different subtle kind of dimensions that make us human. And as we tap into this space, I think with our clients, there's no doubt that as therapists ourselves, we are also in that space. We are also working with those dimensions in the space. So, it makes sense that whatever we might be bringing in from our own experience is part of that container in that interpersonal field. Yeah, as we work with psychedelics and plant medicines. So as we enter these different, I think, layers of being human in that space, and as we kind of open up to those different layers, we have to be very mindful about what we bring in. Yeah, what's ours, what's our clients, what are our shared experiences, and what is emerging in that mystery. Yeah. And it's my understanding that as a therapist, the more we are familiar with the landscape of sadness, or the more we're, experience with the landscape of anger or fear or our own, that comes from our own, healing of our own trauma imprints, then we are so much more equipped to be a guide, I suppose, for other people when they're kind of going through that same experience, because we've been through that in ourselves and we know it's familiar territory for us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I hope I've answered your question.
It's great. That's really, really interesting reflection. Thank you. I've got one more question for you. Is that okay?
Sure. Sure.
How are you doing? You feeling tired, or it's getting late for you over there?
It is. But yeah, you can ask me one more question. I'll be super happy to answer if I can.
Okay. It's going to be a really, really simple one. Just kidding. So in talking about trauma, I also want to make sure that we talk a little bit about resilience, because prevention is often the best medicine, right? And so I'm curious how you think about cultivating resilience, and again, especially in the context of just how, life is suffering. And so we're always just like, one step away from, being confronted with some really challenging experience. And, I think that if I think about how I've been thinking about resilience over the years, before really appreciating the sort of trauma-informed lens, I would think, for example, this sort of came to mind the other day, this like very classic Viktor Frankl quote that circulates a lot in the mindfulness world. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And this can be very inspiring for people who feel stuck. The possibility that there's some freedom to choose how we respond to things. But it can also, I think, be insensitive in the sense that, if a traumatic experience involves a lack of choice, to tell people suddenly like, well, actually you have a choice, so like get on with it, right? Can be really tricky.
If you speak it in that tone, yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
But what one of the I think the interesting kind of core message there is that there's always choice. Right. And it's how we choose to respond to things. And that's been a powerful principle for me personally, and in working with some of my clients, to help people develop a sense of self-efficacy and a sense of like, resilience against stress. And yet again, there may be this piece where it's not trauma informed as a way of approaching it. I'm just curious how you think about resilience in this context.
It's, I think, very interesting, what you've kind of brought up around the subject around kind of, I think, choice and agency and trauma. So as I've kind of mentioned in, the definition of trauma, there are certain times that happen in our lives where we didn't have choice. We didn't, whether we were children or if something happened way too fast. For example, if we were perhaps in a high velocity kind of motorcycle, accident, and we were unable to kind of protect ourselves, or so on and so forth. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that for people that have felt that there's certain, circumstances in their lives where they have felt that there has been a lack of agency. And I think that for these people, from a trauma, perspective, part of the antidote is to renegotiate the trauma so that the body can experience what it's like to have choice again, and what it's like to have agency, and perhaps what it was like if we could replay or renegotiate that certain event, what it was like to have choice, and the body to experience that. So part of, I think, this work in trauma resolution and healing is around cultivating resilience. And we can cultivate resilience in many, many ways. And I agree with you that exploring choice and perhaps giving people who haven't had choice in past experiences the chance and opportunity to renegotiate that can be something that can be very, very empowering for a person. But there are also other things, other elements that can add to our cultivation of resilience. And two things that I will name, which I find very important. Number one is to understand and to track what's happening in our inner world, in our nervous system all the time. and to understand how we can settle and self-regulate ourselves, especially when we're feeling perhaps more activated or in the sympathetic nervous system, for instance. And part of that, being able to self-regulate or co-regulate is really a conversation around our resources and how we use our resources, because all of us have inner resources and outer resources too. And I think that with most people, we are unaware of our resources and how to tap into that resource vortex in a way, healing vortex in a way. And so part of this work around trauma is not, it's not all about focusing on the trauma and focusing on the suffering. More often than not with clients is really around amplifying what is resourceful for them, or what is life affirming, or what's life giving. And because they're living in such a place of neuroception where they feel danger constantly, they are unable to even drink in or receive the resources, the inner and outer resources, which are available in the here and now at all times. Yeah. So those are certain things that I think could be helpful for folks out there to cultivate resilience. Yeah.
That's awesome. Atira, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I wonder, before we wrap up, if you could just tell people how to find you and learn more about these workshops that you're doing that are super important. And I want to make sure people have an opportunity to sign up if it's available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You can find me on my website. It's atiratan.com, and also my Instagram is Atira Tan. And you can also find me on the Aya Healing Retreats website too, as I'm working as the head of integration there. So it's ayahealingretreats.com. And I really, if the audience out there have any questions, I'm really open as well to connecting with the audience. So if folks out there want to just connect and say hi, or if you have a question about what was shared in the podcast, please feel free to reach out. And my email is also on my website as well.
That's very generous of you. And we'll make sure all that stuff is listed in the show notes. Mm-hmm. And once again, thank you so much. Hope you have a nice night of sleep and you're ready to go tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe, for this opportunity. It's been a complete pleasure.
Likewise. Take care. Thanks for watching this episode of the Mindspace podcast. To get more episodes, you can subscribe on this channel or go to your favorite podcast platform. Thanks, and be well.